And we are on to Priest. Starting Priest off with Reliquary of Souls, which is the prime for Priests. 1 cost, 1/3 lifesteal. Obviously, straight up, not necessarily super exciting, but any kind of cards that Priests can use to buff this are relatively powerful, given that they scale off of the lifesteal. Could use the new Power Infusion card, possibly, to make this actually trade up very well, hard to kill, and able to gain you some life. But obviously, it's a 1-cost card, right? So you're not necessarily like hoping to get everything in the world off of your 1-cost card, but when it dies, it shuffles this into your deck. Reliquary Prime, a 7-cost, 6/8 taunt lifesteal. Only you can prevent forest fires. No. Only you can target this with spells and hero powers. He's barking. He stopped. Okay. Nope. He started again. Okay. So a 7/8 or yeah. So a 7-cost 6/8 taunt lifesteal by itself is already like really powerful, and only you being able to target this means that you can heal this, you can buff this. Your opponent can't, polymorph it, hex it, whatever. Obviously, they can still hit it with like a Black Knight off of a Zephyrus. They can Twisting Nether it away. They can silence it if they have a silence minion. But Spellbreaker being rotated to the Hall of Fame does mean that this is a much scarier threat for most decks than otherwise would be, because they can only hit this with minion-based Battlecry effects. Or use some sort of AoE effect on it. And the fact that you can target yourself means that you can help keep this alive as well as buff it, and that's pretty scary. I don't think this is the sort of card you can necessarily build a deck around, because A, it's a legendary, B, it's a legendary that you can only get into play once the first half dies and the opponent can just silence the first half. But I just think this is a solid card for like a control priest type of shell, or a singleton, Highlander style priest deck. I expect to put this into a lot of my decks. Just the 1/3 lifesteal for 1 by itself is actually pretty good against a lot of aggressive decks. They have to spend a significant amount of resources and time like trading into it, or you just plink away. And especially if your deck has any kind of buffs in it, it can be very, very powerful. So I think this is a really solid card, and I expect to see. I think this is a really solid card, and I expect it to see a lot of play. Just as I'm doing a lot of burping. Next up, we have Soul Mirror, a 7-cost legendary spell. Summon copies of enemy minions. They attack their copies. This card, I think, is super, super powerful. Obviously, if your opponent just has a bunch of 5/5s, you play this. As long as you have room for those 5/5s, you kill your opponent's 5/5s. Say your opponent has a bunch of Death Rattle minions. You summon copies of their Death Rattle minions, you attack, and you get all their Death Rattles. Obviously, they do too, but this card just has a lot of flexibility. And as Priest, if you have, say you play this, and your minions rather the summoned minions, the copied minions all attack in, you can then attack with other things on the board, or play something and heal your guys afterwards after you kill the opposing minions. It's very similar to like a light bomb effect, right? Like, at least by itself, it's just going to kill but it only kills your opponent's stuff. So I think this is just a very, very strong card that's going to see a lot of play, and is going to be a huge game swinging effect in a lot of games. Next up is Renew. It's a 1-cost spell. Restore 3 health, discover spell. One of the big changes to the Priest trait map, the Priest class identity, is that they don't really do much card drawing anymore. It's a big part of why Northshire Cleric was sent to the Hall of Fame. They do more like stealing stuff and now discovering stuff. I think this card is just pretty solid. You have to want the heal effect, of course, in order to put this card in your deck. It's not like a powered shield where you're just like, okay, I'm just going to cycle this through. But if you're playing a controlling style of priest deck, gaining some restoring some health either to yourself or to a minion can often be quite powerful. And then discovering a spell, priest does have quite a few relatively low impact spells, but a lot of especially the classic spells, which used to be weak, are actually quite a bit more powerful now. They're buffed. Like having Thought Steal for just 2 mana, having Shadow Word Death for just 2 mana. A lot of the changes that came with priest in this rotation, and you got rid of a lot of the priest spells that you would not necessarily be looking for in some control situations. You did lose a lot of the ways that you could have for priest to actually end games, though. You can't like discover a holy fire to kill your opponent anymore. You can't discover a shadow form to like switch over to a ping plan anymore. But I do think that just this is a reasonably solid card. I could easily see this being played in like an auctioneer style deck, or just like looking to spend 1 to discover a spell, discover another cheap spell, keep going kind of thing. But yeah, I think this is just a generally decent card. Don't expect to see like tons of play, but can easily see this as like a card in like a Highlander style priest deck, or a priest deck that specifically cares about healing effects. Next up, we have Psyche Split. 5 cost, give a minion +1/+2, summon a copy of it. I'm going to play this on Reliquary of Souls and get myself 2 things that have lifesteal and taunt, and only I can target. I think it's just a pretty powerful card. We've seen a lot of like copy a minion, do something in this set, right? There's a copy a demon in Demon Hunter. There's copy something, give it taunt in Druid, and now there's copy a minion and give a minion +1/+2 and then copy it in this. It's also powerful with like death rattle effects. Overall, I think this is probably like a fairly medium card, because in order for this to be powerful, you need to already have something good in play. Priest, though, right now, at least with the sort of direction they're moving, are looking to be a class that is trying to have a sizable minion in play a lot. So yeah, I think this is actually a pretty reasonable card in priest right now. It's something that can be discovered off of spell effects. Like this can come off of the healing card we were just talking about, and having things that with spell discovers that can generate board presence is one of the things that is pretty important to look for. Because a lot of times spells, if you're looking for spells, just like, okay, I'm going to have some sort of effect on the board, kill something, do something incremental, but being able to generate board presence with those spells, I think is actually often quite valuable. And that's somewhere that I can easily see this having an impact. Next up, we have Sethekk Veilweaver. 2 cost, 2/3. After you cast a spell on a minion, add a pre-spell to your hand. This is a card that is very Lyra-like, right? Obviously, Lyra specifically wants you to cast any spell. This you have to cast a spell on a minion, but you can use this with any kind of buff effect. You can use this with Renew. You can use this with now 0 cost Powered Shield that no longer draws a card. But as a 2/3 for 2, it's obviously something that you can even just play down early on. You're not necessarily just playing it. It's not taking up most of your turn to play it and then try and go off. You can easily play this just on turn 2. Maybe it dies, maybe it doesn't, and if it doesn't, then you start casting your buff type cards, renews or whatever on it, and just generate additional value. You can use the card to copy it and then get 2 cards off of each of them, and then a card off of the copy spell as well. So I think this is an interesting card. Giving priest a kind of buff your minion direction that isn't just Divine Spirit. Now Divine Spirit is gone is something that I really appreciate. And I'm sure that I will try to build a deck including this card, because I like priest buffing minions, and I also love random cards, so I'm excited for it. Oh, one thing that I actually only just realized, this actually also works with removal spells. This isn't just on your own minion, this is any minion. So if you play this and just Shadow Word Pain your opponent's guy, or Forbidden Words, or Shadow Word Death your opponent's guy, that also gives you a card. So it's not just a buff spell. You can use this with any kind of target effect. You can play this and smite your opponent's guy and get a spell. So actually, the more I think about it, the more I like this card. I think this is actually a very powerful card, because you can use it with both buff spells as well as removal and just generate value basically anytime you play a spell that isn't just a pure value generator in itself. So the more I think about it, the more I like this card, and I'm even more excited to play it. Next up, we have Dragonmaw Overseer, a 3-cost 2/2. At the end of your turn, give another friendly minion +2/+2. This is like Shadow Ascendant, right? Shadow Ascendant was a 2/2 that gave a minion +1/+1. This is a 2/2 for 3 that gives it +2/+2. Obviously, this is much more impactful immediately, but much easier for your opponent to kill because it comes down slower. It feels like it's a very powerful, like possible snowball effect off of this. Obviously, if your opponent can't kill it right away, and you're getting like +4/+4 from it, this can snowball enormously. You can imagine playing like this, play like Reliquary of Souls in 1, coining this guy out, then you have a 3/5. I think this is at its most powerful if you're able to play like a cheap taunt alongside it, like play like an injured Tol'vir into this guy, and now suddenly your opponent has to get through this injured Tol'vir to this guy, and your Tol'vir is getting bigger each turn too. I feel this is just like a fairly strong card for a board presence based priest deck, which is a strategy that that priest is being pushed toward to some degree with the removal of Divine Spirit, and actually playing like a deck that cares about controlling the board and keeping a minion around for more than a turn to just blow your opponent up with a single spell. Speaking of buffs, this is a very powerful priest buff. Apophysis, 3-cost, give a minion +2/+3, and lifesteal. Obviously, priests doesn't necessarily have ways to use their life as a resource, like, say, Demon Hunter, so lifesteal itself is a lot weaker, I think, in priest than it is in classes that have the ability to attack into things with their face and use their life total as a resource in that way. But this is just a powerful card, right? If you can think back to Velen's Chosen, if you're playing Hearthstone way back then, Velen's Chosen was an incredibly powerful card in the early versions of Dragon Priest, in basically any early game priest deck. And this is obviously a little bit less powerful than Velen's Chosen. It doesn't give +2/+4, it gives +2/+3. Lifesteal, though, if you are playing against any kind of deck that's looking to race you, they are not going to be able to do that when you have this on anything. So I feel like the board-based buff priest is a very real thing. And this is definitely, I think, going to be one of the significant elements of it, because being able to give the plus attack is crucial. Not just being able to buff your minions' health. Being able to buff your minions' health is obviously valuable, but being able to buff your minions' attack and health so they can actually trade up when you actually play the buff card is really important. And now that there's no Divine Spirit, you can actually give priests good buffs that they can load up onto these early game minions, and not just assume that they will kill your opponent in a single turn with them. So I think this card is great. I think it's going to be very, very valuable in any kind of board-based priest deck. That said, a lot of board-based priest decks historically have struggled against any kind of control deck because they don't necessarily have ways to close at the game and don't have great card generation or card draw. So we'll have to see if there are enough tools or if the metagame ends up looking hostile to them if there's a lot of control warrior decks, because anytime I ever played board priest, it wasn't a bunch of death rattles and I got brawled, I lost. This also works extremely well with Wild Pyromancer. The fact that it gives the minion lifesteal if your opponent has a board of small minions, and you're just like, okay, Wild Pyromancer, Apophysis into anything, that'll just wipe out their board and gain you a ton of life. Obviously, also buffing the Wild Pyromancer itself. Pyromancer, I think, is going to be less of a core card in priest decks for a couple of reasons. One, the change to Power Word Shield no longer drawing a card means it's much less appealing to play, though it does make it more powerful in a lot of situations with Wild Pyromancer. But perhaps more importantly, the fact that Northshire Cleric is going to the Hall of Fame means that you can no longer use Wild Pyromancer plus Circle of Healing and Northshire Cleric as an enormous boost of card draw. So if you do play with Wild Pyromancer, it's much more of a, okay, I'm specifically playing with Wild Pyromancer because there are a lot of swarm decks, and alongside Apophysis, it's going to give you just an absolute nail in the coffin with those decks. Next up, we have Imprisoned Homunculus. Just a 1-cost 2/5 taunt, dormant for 2 turns. This card is really interesting. Obviously, like, it doesn't have the sort of shiny, like, ooh, crazy awaken power, but like a 2/5 that you only spend 1 mana on is really big deal. In priest especially, you just can play this in turn 1, and then the next couple turns you just take some damage, then this guy comes into play, and then it's hard for your opponent to kill in the first place, you know, on turn 3 even. 5 is a lot of health, and then, okay, you start buffing it, and then all that damage you took for your opponent attacking you the first few turns where this was dormant, well, you just put Apophysis on it and you life stole it away. So, this is obviously a card that's going to be a very weak draw late in the game, which is true of most of the Imprisoned cards. You usually want to have them on curve, or else, they're going to be much less impactful. And this, I think, is one that suffers the most from that, because what this gives you is powerful stats relative to its cost in the turn you're on, and that's the sort of thing that drops off dramatically as time goes on. But this is a very powerful card to play on turn 1, and then have the ability to your opponent can't kill it, then you have the ability to buff it in later turns. So I think this is a card that has a very high potential to see significant play. It's also, because it is just 5 health for 1 mana, could very easily be something that you actually just plan to inner fire. Even if you're not Divine Spiriting, playing like a Power Infusion or Apophysis and then inner firing this, it's hitting for a lot very quickly. The biggest issue with playing inner fire and all these buffs, I think, for Priest in the current environment without Northshire Cleric is the fact that you don't have much card draw, but there is the Sethekk dude who gives you the card generation when you play spells on minions, and I think that while not quite as powerful as drawing cards for your own deck, because you very likely will get cards that don't necessarily do exactly what your deck wants to do, does have the ability to make up for that potential card disadvantage. All right, where are we? Next up, we have Dragonmaw Sentinel, a 1/4 for 2 battlecry. If you're holding a dragon, gain +1 attack and lifesteal. So this is just a 2/4 with lifesteal for 2, which is really good, because when am I not holding a dragon? I mean, I am a dragon, I should count anyway, but no, this I think is like a very, very, very powerful card. 2/4 lifesteal for 2, super strong. Very, very good card to encourage Dragon Priest. Dragon Priest hasn't really had all that many powerful tools recently, but as we were discussing, used to be one of the dominant versions of Priest way back in the day, back during Blackwing Lair and such. Blackrock Mountain, that's what it was. Blackwing Lair. That's part of what is in Blackrock Mountain. But yeah, I think this is again another powerful card to buff in particular. Lifesteal obviously scales well with the buffs, though the buff that we're talking about, Apophysis, as far as attack buffs, is something that gives you lifesteal anyway, but even just a 2/4 for 3 is extremely powerful. And there are a good selection of dragons in Priest right now, for like a mid-range style of strategy, which is exactly what this would be. So I can easily also see this in like a Highlander style deck, right? Like this is a good early play in like Galakron Highlander Priest, which already has the incentive to play dragons in the form of like Fateweaver or whatever too. So I think this is definitely an interesting card that obviously needs a shell around it because it's specific to a tribal synergy, but can be a very powerful card in those, and keeping you alive, which is something that a lot of times current versions of Dragon Priest, if those exist at all, maybe I'm the only person in the world who plays them, can really struggle. If you're up against aggressive decks like Dragon Hunter right now, having this 2/4 lifesteal body is huge against something like a Fairy Dragon. I had to sneeze through like half of that. Okay. And lastly, for Ashes of Outlands cards for Priest, we have Skeletal Dragon. Speaking of cards for Dragon Priest, this is a 7-cost 4/9 taunt. The end of your turn, add a dragon to your hand. There's a couple of things I like about this. One, obviously it's a dragon. I like that. Two, just a big taunt, a big dragon taunt in Priest is very appealing for a variety of different decks. One, if you're playing like a mid-range style of deck, this is a totally reasonable like card that can help enable your dragon synergy cards fairly early on, as well as can help protect you and solidify the board. Also has tons of health if you are playing inner fire, things like that. Also just generates additional dragon. A ton of health on something that's generating value if it stays in play is very valuable. 9 is a lot of health on 7 mana. That just ends up being a huge roadblock for your opponent that's very likely to generate multiple cards over the course of a game. So this is a card that can give you solid defense against aggressive strategies as long as you can survive to this point. And then against like a control deck, it can generate a bunch of additional resources for you to use to actually grind through their removal. So I like basically every single thing about this card, and I expect to play a lot of it. All right, next up, we're just talking about the new cards that Priest got in the classic set. I talked about these elsewhere, but I want to talk about them specifically as part of this because they are new cards. I talked about the Demon Hunter cards, might as well talk about the new Priest cards. So, Psyche Conjurer, 1-cost 1/1 Battlecry, copy a card from your opponent's deck and add it to your hand. I think this is a fairly weak card. I think this is the weakest of the new cards that were added. I've seen people compare this to like Babbling Book and such. But copying a card from your opponent's deck, I think, is often actually going to be worse than like a random spell. Obviously, that may sound a little strange because the random spell can include a lot of things that your opponent didn't put into their deck. But more importantly, it's not necessarily just the trigger; it's the fact that a 1/1 in Priest doesn't do very much. In Mage, a Babbling Book can combine with a ping to take down like a 2 health minion, whereas a 1/1 in Priest is like, okay, it's a 1/1, it's dead, it's not going to combine with anything. Unless you like buff your 1/1 with like something, it's just generally like small minions are not that useful in most Priest decks. So I think this is a pretty weak card. I think it feels more like it exists in order to sort of further cement the class identity of copying stuff from your opponent's deck, rather than something that I think is likely to show up in actual competitive decks. Next up, we have Power Infusion. I referred to this card a couple of times earlier. 4-cost, give a minion +2/+6. I don't think this card is like great or anything, but I think it's actually something that people ought to keep in mind. +2/+6 is a lot of stats for 4 mana. Obviously, you compare this to like Blessing of Kings, right? Blessing of Kings hits a lot harder, but Priest cares a lot about health, both because of stuff like Inner Fire, but also because your hero power allows you to keep healthy minions alive. If your minions can trade up and survive, being able to heal them is a really big deal. And alongside your hero power, there's new cards like Renew that can allow you to keep them alive as well. And we even saw a card very similar to this, in fact, the exact same text before at 5 mana in the form of Power Word Tentacles in an expansion set. That never saw constructed play, but I think this goes to show how the absence of Divine Spirit, the rotating of it to the Hall of Fame, means that Priest cards can be better. You lose the potential 1-turn combo kill of Divine Spirit Inner Fire, but you can still use this with Inner Fire and kill your opponent, just not from like 40 health. You can do big burst damage if you have health buffs alongside Inner Fires as well. And even if you're not necessarily playing like Power Infusion or Inner Fire in your deck, or you're not playing Inner Fire in your deck, you can generate it from something like the Sethekk that I talked about earlier that generates a random spell. You can discover an Inner Fire from Renew. So even if these cards are not in your deck, it's relevant that they exist for the power level of something like this in a lot of decks. You don't necessarily have to play Inner Fire to Inner Fire burst combo someone when you have cards that can generate a random Inner Fire. Next up, we have Kul Tiran Chaplain, a 2-cost 2/3 with Battlecry, give a friendly minion +2 health. We've seen a lot of versions of Priest minions that give your other minions plus health. This one's a little bit weird because in order for this to be at its best, you want to have had a 1-drop to then play. There's not really great 1-drops for Priest. As I mentioned, the 1-cost 1/1, not really something you're likely to play. But I can easily imagine playing a Priest deck that uses the early game buff cards and this and like Blazing Battle Mage, right? And just plays Battle Mage into this and just try to tempo out your opponent and buff those minions and like rush them down. So I think, you know, you can use this with like Reliquary of Souls. Make sure that that stays around longer. You can buff that more. This is just a really, really solid card. The issue is, what do you use it with in the early turns? You know, you could possibly like coin out a 2-drop into this. That's, you know, very effective. You could play Dragon Priest, right? You could play like coin Fairy Dragon into this. A Fairy Dragon with 4 health is really hard for people to kill. So yeah, I think that this is, you know, a generally like solid card. It's unamazing to me, mostly because Priest doesn't have great 1-drops to put it on. But if Priest ends up with strong 1-drops, or say something like another Shadow Ascendant, right? Like using this in the same deck as that new Shadow Ascendant-ish guy, you can possibly like play that guy, and then if he's able to survive even a turn, buff him, make him harder to kill, and then make it very difficult for your opponent to actually get through. Oops, wrong button. No, wrong button. Next up is Scarlet Subjugator. This is a 1-cost 2/1 battlecry. Give it a enemy minion -2 attack till your next turn. This is maybe a 1-drop that you play on turn 1. Probably not. One thing that I think is actually very exciting about this card is that it combines with Cabal Shadow Priest. We actually saw back in the Shrinkmeister days a lot of Shrinkmeister into Cabal Shadow Priests of minions all over the place. You can even like double Scarlet Subjugator into Cabal Shadow Priest on really big things. You can use Subjugator to shrink something and then Shadow Word Paint it, or shrink something and then Forbidden Words it, or whatever. You can also just use it to shrink your opponent's guy and trade into it. The more Priest it has minions that they're actually playing to the board, which there are a lot of cards that encourage that, the more likely there is minion to minion combat, which makes something like Scarlet Subjugator better, as you know, it can, you know, just be used to effectively -2 attack a guy, so your guy doesn't take damage on the attack in, and not just combo with other cards. But the fact that it can do both of those things, I think, is actually pretty attractive. So I think this is a pretty solid card. I don't think it's going to be showing up all over the place, but I do think that, you know, as a in a Priest board focused deck, if there is, you know, a lot of minion on minion combat, this is effective. And obviously the fact that it can combine with Cabal and take a wide range of things is also very powerful. Next up is Shadowword Ruin. This is finally a actual board clear style card for Priest in the classic set. Destroy all minions with 5 or more attack. This is obviously not quite as effective as something like a you know, Psychic Scream or Mass Hysteria or whatever, but is something that you can build toward. Interestingly, so many of the Priest cards themselves end up buffing, you know, +2 attack. There's very few things that are going to buff your things a lot, other than like Inner Fire. So this can easily be used not just as a board clear, but as a clear for your opponent's big minions, while you preserve your board of smaller minions. You can even use this with like Inner Fire to Inner Fire your opponent's minion, Shadowword Ruin, clear off multiple minions, and actually just bust through with your own. So I think this is just a really important card. The fact that Priest gets a board clear style card in the classic set means that they don't have to just keep making new board clears for Priest every single set, which means Priest can get other new stuff. So yeah, I think this card is just generally solid. I think we'll see a lot of it. I think that obviously it means that there are a lot of ways to play around what Priest is going to try and do to clear your board. But between this and the now buffed Holy Nova and Holy Smite and things like that, there's a lot more ways for Priest to actually kill opposing things effectively. And I think that, you know, that's just generally good for Priest moving forward. And last, but certainly not least, is the new Priest Legendary in the classic set, Natalie, Selene, 8-cost, 8/1, battlecry, destroy a minion, and gain its health. This card is just good. You know, I've seen people compare this to Vol'jin, and I'm like, do you realize that this kills the minion, right? Vol'jin stole a minion's health and then still left an X2. This just kills it. You know, previously Prophet Valen was the legendary in the Priest Classic set, and that was only ever played in like 1-turn kill combos. This I feel like can be played in virtually any Priest deck. You know, if you're playing a board control Priest deck, this is a way to kill your opponent's biggest minion and give you a threat. If you're playing, you know, a tempo Priest deck, this is a way to kill your opponent's biggest minion and give you a threat. If you're playing any version of Priest, this is something that can easily fit in some capacity. So yeah, I think that this is just a really solid minion that's going to see a lot of play. Obviously, it doesn't go into combo style Priest decks, but I expect that given the removal of a lot of the burst damage often per Priest, as well as the card draw in Northshire Cleric, that's going to be less the identity of the Priest decks we see moving forward. So I expect we'll see a lot more of this card. And that's Priest.